Welcome back to another episode of Junkyard Storytime. My name is Joel. We are at Chesterfield Auto Parts in Richmond, Virginia, here to look at a 1984 Nissan 300ZX Turbo. Let's get started. So let's talk about some Z-car history. If we roll the clock back a little bit, the first Z car was the Datsun 240Z that ran from 1970 to 1973. This was a huge hit. It was an absolute home run for Nissan, and it rocked the sports car industry when it came out. Its successor was called the 260Z. It was only sold in the US for 1 year, 1974, and then that got refreshed to be the 280Z for model years 1975 to 1978. The Datsun Z car received a full overhaul in 1979. They changed that to the 280ZX, and this was actually the first generation when the car sort of started to become more of a grand touring coupe, not as much a lightweight sports car. And it's also the first Z car that offered a turbocharged model. Now, at the end of that car's production, the all-new 300ZX was released, and that's the car that we have here in front of us in the junkyard. That new generation was known by the chassis code of the Z31. That also marked a change from the Datsun nameplate to Nissan. So this is kind of a weird time in Japanese car history. Nissan was the name of the parent company in Japan, but they'd been selling their cars under the Datsun name for their export markets. Now, the rumor goes that the Nissan executives weren't pleased when they learned that Honda and Toyota names were recognizable worldwide, but in most of the international markets, people were not familiar with the name Nissan. So they made this big change to start naming all of their cars in all markets with the make of Nissan. Their hope was to basically unify their brand identity. And some of the Nissan cars actually had badging in the late 70s that said things like Datsun by Nissan and things like that to kind of help prepare for the upcoming name change. And the official name change occurred on their vehicles produced from 1982 to 1984. And then even some of their cars produced after the transition still had Datsun badges. But they had this large advertising campaign where they tried to explain this change to their buyers.
We're changing the name of Datsun to Nissan.
I hope you're not changing all that room.
No, all we're changing is our name. From now on, we're Nissan.
I hope you're not changing that great performance, Datsun, Nissan.
We wouldn't dream of it. All we're changing is our name.
Okay, from now on, you're Nissan.
Come alive, come and drive. Major motion from Nissan.
The name is Nissan.
So anyways, let's go ahead and talk about this Junkyard Z31 that we have in front of us. So as I mentioned, this is the turbo version of the 300ZX. This is basically their flagship coupe in their lineup at that time. Now at this time, you have all the Malaise era cars that were producing all the low-powered engines. Those are starting to kind of wind down, particularly in American cars. So remember, you had all the federally mandated emissions equipment on cars in the 70s. This is choking off the horsepower from all the horsepower wars of the late 1960s and early 70s, and it took American companies a while to get their engines back up to where they were making pretty good power. Now this is starting to happen by the mid-80s. You've got V8s that are making decent power again. You've got some unusual choices like the Mustang SVO that was turbocharged, the Buick Grand National was turbocharged. Things like that are happening. So at this time, the 300ZX would have competed with some cars like the Toyota Celica Supra, the Chevy Camaro, the Pontiac Firebird, Mitsubishi Starion, the Ford Mustang, including that SVO, and I guess maybe the Corvette would have been a competitor. It kind of depends on what a buyer was looking for at that time. But some of these cars actually had throttle body injection, or some of them even had carburetors when the 300ZX came out. So it's actually to Nissan's benefit that their car had multi-port fuel injection. So let's go ahead and take a look at the interior. Now, one thing you'll notice about the interior is sharp angles and straight lines are everywhere. Again, this is very on brand for a Japanese sports car from the 80s, and we could talk about that a little bit more when we get to the exterior. So this 300ZX went even further than the 280ZX in the territory of turning it into a personal luxury coupe and less of a lightweight sports car. Now, you can see this in the options that are visible just on this car. Now, just a reminder, this car came out in 1984, and it came with cruise control, power mirrors, power windows, the most unnecessarily complicated looking dome light, headlight washers, a turbo boost gauge. Power seats were an option, but this car doesn't actually have them. And they had the famous Nissan voice warning system where the stereo speakers were used to communicate messages to the driver. So things like door is open and fuel level is low and lights are on. You could also get these cars with a full display digital instrument cluster, which again, insane for 1984. Now, look at how advanced this instrumentation was at the time. I will show you a video. Now, again, this car didn't have this option, but you have this digital line that moves left to right to show your current RPM, but also the whole RPM band would actually rise when you would apply the throttle, and it would fall when you would come off the throttle. Absolutely insane. Now, the electronic gauge cluster option also came with a digital fuel economy computer, electronic climate control, a compass, and an acceleration meter. That's right, Nissan gave you a gauge that showed in G's just how hard you were accelerating, which is so bizarre because this is an option I don't think anybody knew existed or asked for. But anyways, I just can't believe Nissan really put all this stuff into one car. So what we also need to talk about is an option that this car in the junkyard did have, which was the electronically adjustable suspension, again, in 1984. So there's a switch on the center console that lets you adjust between 3 suspension firmness settings, so you can basically change your suspension on the fly. Now, allegedly, this was standard on all the turbo models. I don't really know how reliable it was or how effective it was, but I have never seen this on a car this old. I sat in an old Corvette back in the day when the ZR1 was new in the early 90s, and that had electronic suspension, and that was a big deal, and that was several years later. So if you have seen a production car with electronic suspension that's older than this, please let me know in the comments. Now, all of the Z cars prior to this 300ZX, they had a very similar exterior shape. They were taking lots of cues from the swooping classic lines of 1960 sports cars, but this 300ZX actually took the design in a different direction. You could see it's all sharp angles, it's straight lines, square edges. Nearly all the curves are just gone from this car. You can see the taillights are squared off. The quarter side windows, they're literally triangles. The front of the car is shaped like a javelin, and you can see that that shape is helped out by a classic piece of 1980s equipment, the pop-up headlights. Now, these pop-up headlights, they're a little different from what I'm used to seeing on most other cars from this era. You can actually partially see the headlight lenses even when the pop-up doors are in the closed position. So that's kind of different. Now, when the 300ZX Turbo was released, it was the most powerful Z car that Nissan ever produced. This was a V6 engine with the code VG30ET. It made 200 horsepower and 227 pound-feet of torque. This was a big change for Nissan, obviously, because all the Z cars before this, they had inline-6 engines. This used a single Garrett turbocharger, and it made about 7 pounds of boost stock. Oddly enough, kind of like the Buick Grand National, you have one turbo for a V-shape engine. So that means all the exhaust gas coming from both banks are going to a single turbo. It's pretty different from a lot of the newer twin-turbo cars that would use a turbo for each bank of cylinders. So I know this is kind of a way back reference, but in the 80s, there was a movie called Cannonball Run 2, and there was a Mitsubishi Starion that was being driven by Jackie Chan and Jaws, and it had all this ludicrous technology inside. There were computers and police evasion gadgets, and it could work as a submarine, and it was ridiculous, which I'm pretty sure was the point. But I always thought that that was funny when you compare it to the car we have in front of us and the 300ZX Turbo, you know, that came with all of the digital equipment. because that stereotype or that satire in that movie is kind of like what the 300ZX was like in real life. You know, you have all this technology in this car, nobody really saw it coming, and Nissan dumped it all into a single car. And of course, that's kind of funny too, because the Storytime actually competed with the 300ZX in real life. So none of this space-age equipment on the 300ZX really makes it a better sports car. It really just makes it a more attractive lifestyle accessory, right? You buy this car so you can look at all the whiz-bangs and the beep boops, and maybe technology is your hobby, or maybe you buy it because you want to just share it with other people or impress your passengers, or just enjoy it for yourself because it's something nice. You know, there are countless reasons why you might buy a sporty car with this much technology. And apparently there were enough reasons for people, because Nissan sold a lot of these. They sold 270,000 of this generation 300ZX in the US market. And it's actually more Z cars than they have sold of any Z car they have produced since then, but it wasn't the highest selling Z car for Nissan. That was actually the previous generation, the 280ZX, and that sold a little more than 20% more than this Z31 you see here. Now, the general response from the buying public was something like, hey, that's a cool car. And I'm obviously summarizing this very much, but the response from the enthusiast driving public wasn't quite as positive. People complained that it was too heavy and had too much equipment on it that nobody asked for, and, all the stuff that we've already described. It doesn't really perform as well on twisty roads and in track driving as its main competitors, like the Celica Supra and the Mitsubishi Starion, and it never really developed the same reputation for putting a smile on the driver's face. It wasn't known as being a driver's car. But there's an audience today. The audience for this car today is for people who want that 80s style, inside and out. And the over-the-top excess for a bunch of the gadgetry that's in the car, that's actually the reason you would buy this car now. I mean, there's people who buy this car just because they want the electronic instrumentation because it's so bizarre. And it came out in the 80s, so in my opinion, if the Wolf of Wall Street was living a more modest life of excess, I think he would have driven a 300ZX Turbo instead of a Lamborghini. If you buy this car now, you're buying it because I can't believe they actually built this, and not so much this car is so amazing to drive, right? It's very different than why you might buy a Miata today, or why you might buy an MR2 or something like that. This Z31, I think, is often misunderstood. A lot of people think that Nissan missed the mark when they came out with this car, but I think that's because people assume that this 300ZX is a true successor to the original 240Z. But in a lot of ways it wasn't, and Nissan was almost creating a new subcategory of sports coupe, and I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call this a technology sports coupe. And you've got some luxury items, you've got some pleasant performance available, but you don't have to wring out the engine to get it. You've got some gadgets to make the driving experience nicer, but it's not really competing with the hard driving, autocross type cars that are out there. Now, I know I just made up this category, but I also think there's another car that will come later in the technology sports coupe category, and that car was pretty much considered a bit of a flop, and that was the Dodge Stealth and the Mitsubishi 3000 GT twins. I wish I could make a whole video on this car, and maybe I will someday, but the turbo versions of these cars, they had all-wheel drive, four-wheel steering, active aerodynamics, an electronically adjustable exhaust, electronic suspension, and as these cars actually got several years into production, Mitsubishi started removing some of that equipment to try to keep the build costs down. So, all that being said, this 300ZX is kind of in a class almost of its own. I think there might actually be some other technology sports coupes out there. So if you can think of any that were successful, please let me know in the comments. I think this is a neat little piece of history. As always, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video. Cheers!